What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video in our Archetype series where we're theory crafting all of the archetypes for specific classes on Ashes of Creation or in Ashes of Creation. Sorry if I'm a little lower on the energy scale today. I've been fighting a cold for the last 3 or 4 days, but I really wanted to make sure I get this video out because I'm going to be really busy the rest of the week. So I thought we could just jump into the fighter. You know, traditionally a fighter, as we all probably know or think we know, is a just melee range, usually DPS. Most fighters have like one tank spec, maybe 1 or 2 DPS options that you can build with them. So it's going to be interesting to go through all the intersections or the archetypes of fighter and see how we can flavor fighter slightly different to give all these archetypes a individual identity and hopefully have some fun ideas with them. So let's just jump right into them. So the first one on our list is where fighter intersects with bard, which is Bladedancer. So at the moment, any intersection with bard as your secondary is interesting because we know very little about what a bard is going to be in Ashes of Creation. Now, there's a lot of whispers, theories, things like that going around on how they could do it. You know, there are bards in other classes, other games. Final Fantasy being kind of one of the more prominent ones. Where you see a lot of bard play. Now, I will say that I've played a bard in a lot of tabletop games, so it'll be interesting how they bring a bard in, just because in most MMOs, you know, I think it's hard to balance a support class. Something that's primarily a support makes it a little harder for solo player content, leveling up by yourself. You know, as much as you want to promote community in a game and playing with your friends and your pals, you know, there's going to be instances where you just jump on because you only have an hour or two to play and you're going to be by yourself. And if you roll the bard, will you be able to do a lot of content? Maybe at lower levels, but at higher levels? You know, so I think balancing a support class is really hard. And in that, I think balancing the archetype where it intersects with a non-support class is going to be equally as difficult. But let's go for it. So where fighter intersects with bard, you get Bladedancer. So the first thing that comes in my head when I think of a Bladedancer is a dervish. I think dervish has always been a really cool archetype, a really cool subclass, prestige class, whatever you want to call it in various games. I've always enjoyed the idea of it. You know, just a really agile, dancing swordsman, usually with 2 swords, usually a scimitar. You know, usually you get like this Middle Eastern desert-inspired aesthetic when you think of a Bladedancer. Not that you have to be, but that's just kind of what they are in my mind, like really desert inspired. But a Bladedancer here would be really cool. I'm thinking of a fighter who self-buffs themselves. You know, they use some bard abilities that just self-buff themselves. Maybe they can do a little bit of buffing to the opponents, but considering fighter is primary, dealing damage and being in melee would be much more important. So when it intersects with bard, I imagine it dancing around, self-buffing themselves. Maybe they can get in a rhythm, literally, like as a mechanic. You know, get in a rhythm, and while they're quote-unquote in rhythm, you know, maybe abilities have slightly less cooldowns, you know, because they're flowing in a dance. So they're going from like one move to the other, and everything's kind of seamless, so maybe that can help with cooldowns. You know what I mean? I know that we're not really doing a typical... I don't know for sure. But from what I've gathered, they don't want a typical 5-second cooldown, 3-second cooldown, 2-second cooldown, like a countdown clock on your abilities, as much as they just want the animation of the ability to take a second, or 2 seconds, or 3 seconds, and then as soon as it's done, you can jump into the next ability. That way it feels more action, I think, because it makes it seem more smooth. You know, you're not like, ability, okay, I've got 5 seconds till I can do anything, I guess I'll just right click or I'll just auto attack. So they're trying to get rid of some of that downtime, kind of get rid of some of that sticking to your rotation at the most optimal timing and things like that. And then there will be abilities that can cancel certain animations. I'm assuming these will be like dodge abilities or movement abilities in order to make fighting reactive. You know, you'd hate to jump into an ability, then you see another person charging up an ability, and instead of being able to dodge, you're just locked in your animation. You may have some abilities that are, you know, maybe they are on a cooldown or something to that effect, but they cancel an animation so that you can dodge and play reactively. But with a Bladedancer, maybe they just allow the animations to speed up a little quicker, quote unquote, reducing cooldown time. You know, if they decide to go with cooldown times that you can monitor, like on a display, maybe it just reduces the cooldown. That way, it feels like you're in a flow and you're in a rhythm. And the longer you stay in rhythm, maybe it maxes out to a certain percentage of cooldown reduction. I have no idea why I'm yawning so much. But that would feel really fun as a Bladedancer, because you start doing your attacks and your abilities and you're going and you're being, you're hitting certain criteria, and all of a sudden you're in a rhythm. And then the more you're in your rhythm or your flow, you're getting maybe quicker, you can do more abilities, and you're dancing around and moving around, and it feels good. Or maybe they could do something to where once you're a Bladedancer, maybe, I don't know, this could get too complicated, but I'm thinking like if you move in between attacks, even if it's like I hit an ability and when it's over I move a little to the right or the left, but like issuing an X amount of movement commands between attacks, makes the next attack do less or have less of a cooldown or a faster animation, however they're going to do it. That way it kind of feels like you're dancing. I know you're not technically dancing, but you know what I mean? So like you attack and then you move and then you attack and then you move and then you attack and then you move, and it builds up a bar or a meter or something to that effect. And once you get in a quote unquote dance, rhythm, whatever, now you're just really, I don't know, it just feels like it'd be fun to play that kind of class. It's giving you a lot of emphasis, giving you a lot of benefits to kind of play into the thematics of the class of dancing while you're fighting. So that would be kind of neat. It'd be interesting to see how they could play with that. How do we incorporate it? Because if they're going hybrid system, so action with a little bit of tab targeting kind of interwoven, action combat, you're already moving usually quite a bit, standing still, spamming attacks, things like that, like you would see in New World. So if everybody's doing it, how do you make it different for the Bladedancer? So there's still a lot of questions on how to do that, but I still like the idea of the Bladedancer involving movement either in between attacks or having some kind of rhythm, because it's a bard, like some kind of rhythm thing. I don't know how to, like some kind of system where if I hit like attack, 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 and I'm kind of on a rhythm, like a 4-4 or a 3-4 or something like that, where it's like boom, 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 and then like, or you can speed up the rhythm and it's like bum 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 bum, or something to play with the music idea, but with a fighter, so like you're attacking on the beat or off the beat. Maybe that's how they do it, like, and they just incorporate this like fighter playing to music kind of deal. Maybe I'm getting too complicated from like a programming standpoint, but because we got to remember that the systems with each of these has to be somewhat simple, so that like it's easier for them to do in balance, without making one so much more in depth than any of the others and making that the most popular choice. But yeah, so I think Bladedancer I think the easiest, most simple way to give it identity and maybe actually be like able to be done would be to incorporate some way of either reducing cooldowns or animation, or increasing animation speed when you incorporate movements in between abilities to some extent, or something like that. That way you get a dance or a rhythm. Alright, so then we'll go to Fighter and Cleric. You get Highsword. So I immediately think of like a knight, just from Highsword. I think of somebody who's just very prim and proper, shiny metal, uses a sword, potentially one-handed. But then we know Cleric as an augment will give you life and death both as a choice. So if it gives you life, if you choose life, then I could see you healing through divine interventions, adding holy damage or divine damage to your weapon, blessing yourself, maybe giving yourself a shield or two. Very self-centered is the one I can't think of, but very like solo content oriented, where you're not really healing the party, but you're able to heal yourself a little bit. So like in a group setting, the Highsword could heal itself enough to where the healer can focus on the other people in lighter content. I don't know if this is a big discussion, but like trash content or just regular mobs or ads, like if they can heal themselves enough where the healer can like drop small things on them, like if there's HOTS in the game, or like small heals, so they can focus on the people who can't heal themselves, that don't have a cleric secondary, right? So that would be really cool as a melee DPS to be able to heal yourself enough, A, to get through solo content pretty well, but B, to kind of take a little pressure off a healer by being able to heal yourself. Now, if we swap to Death Augment on a cleric, I think a Highsword could still be really fun. I think that then you're looking at more of like debuffing your opponent and healing through like lifesteal or blood draining or whatever you want with the Death Augment of cleric to be. But that could also be fun. I see a Highsword as one weapon, like one-handed, it's like single-handed. So maybe not dual wielding. I don't really see that. It doesn't really match the idea that I have in my head. But they can heal themselves using, maybe they're a sword and board, maybe. But I see them more as a DPS with just like one two-handed weapon or like a long sword. But if they use I guess a long sword would be two-handed, or broadsword. But you know what I mean? They have a sword in one hand. They can wield it one-handed or maybe switch it to two-handed, what have you. But they are self-healing and they do a lot of damage, almost like a toned-down Ret Paladin kind of deal. And then just flavor them with death and blood if they're a Death Augment. Yeah. I see a lot of the cleric stuff kind of a lot of self-healing or debuffing or buffing. They always said if cleric is a secondary, you'll be able to heal yourself, maybe assist, but you won't ever replace a cleric primary archetype. Okay, then we go to Weapon Master. So this one I was trying to think of, how could we really take advantage of a fighter doubling down? And so what I was thinking of is, what if they gave him kind of that, what's it called, Titan script? Is that what it's called, from Fury or Arms and WoW from back in the day, where a Weapon Master could dual wield two-handed weapons? I feel like that would be really cool. I think that could just be, that might be just about all you have to do with that archetype to give it a really cool feel is... the fighter intersection, the Weapon Master gets to dual wield two-handed weapons. Now balancing that and everything, I have no idea what they had to do when they did that in WoW, but you could look at that as a case study. But I think that would give it a lot of really cool flavor, and without, obviously you might have to modify some abilities or give them an ability or two that's Weapon Master specific. We saw one in the reveal. It was like a giant golden hammer kind of smashing down. So that's neat, but I think just letting them dual wield two-handed weapons, I think, would lock this archetype up pretty easy. Be fun to play, be a unique play style. I also thought about a Weapon Master being more about offense and less about defense. So if you haven't caught some of my other videos, I talked about the blocking system. I thought maybe they could come up with a nice standard blocking system and then modify it on an archetype basis. So for example, for a Weapon Master, perhaps they get a slight bonus to the amount of damage they block or reduce, or don't take so much recoil or something like that if they block with two weapons, dual wielding, right? Something like that, so that not only does it incentivize you to use another system in the game, the blocking system, but it also just plays into the fact that they have they're going to be dual wielding a lot, primarily with dual wielding two-handed weapons. Like, what if they get a bonus to blocking with X amount for being dual wielding, and then maybe X amount more if they're dual wielding two-handed weapons, or maybe X amount less. Like they block less than if they were blocking with one-handed weapons, if they will two-handed weapons, just because now while they're bigger, they're also like harder to hold on to. I don't know what you might want to flavor that with more or less, but you get what I'm saying. So if they start with a basic blocking system and they kind of flesh that out and get that to a really good spot, and make it just really basic, then they can modify it on an archetype basis to make blocking more advantageous for maybe melee classes or things that are going to want to block a lot anyway because they're in the shit. And B, I think it could really give their blocking system life by being able to balance it or change it or whatever on an archetype basis. And then I think it'll give each archetype some assistance in their archetype identity by giving them a bump to block in a slightly unique way. They don't have to be crazy unique, but giving them like like this, giving him a buff to blocking with two weapons. And then more or less with two-handed weapons, then that makes you automatically, not only does that's like, oh, that's cool, well, that's one of the classes that gets a bonus to blocking if they have two weapons. So that's unique. Oh, well, then I have another choice again inside the archetype of whether or not I want to wield two one-handed or two-handed. And the trade-off is, okay, well, two one-handed might do a little less damage, or maybe their max damage potential is less, but I have better blocking. Okay, well, when I will two-handed, I have higher damage, but my blocking's not as good. You see what I mean? So now you're making, or now you're giving yourself additional choices inside the archetype. That way, not only does it feel unique by choosing the archetype, then you feel a little unique inside of that on whether you want to do two one-handed or two-handed. Now, one thing we have to keep in mind is that, obviously, with our new era in gaming, all about meta and what have you, one's going to be better than the other, and that's what most people are going to play. But yeah, doing that, and then maybe Weapon Master can affect the speed of certain weapons. That could be neat too, but if you add that with dual wielding two-handed, I might get a little too out of control. But you see where they could like play with Weapon Master increasing the speed, or maybe that's their choice. Maybe they can modify weapons. Maybe they could make a two-handed weapon a one-hander, or give it a faster attack speed. You know what I mean? Or maybe they can wield a one-handed as a two-handed, if that makes sense. I don't know if it does, and give it more damage. That would be kind of another cool way that I just thought of. I have notes, but this isn't in my notes. It's something I just thought of. Like, what if they could modify their weapons like that? Not necessarily stat-wise or anything, because then, yeah, not necessarily stat-wise, but maybe just like a general, like you can take a two-handed weapon and you can modify it one of two ways or three ways. You can take a one-handed weapon and you can modify it one of three ways. Or you can take a sword or a hammer and you can modify it one of two ways. And that way it creates a little more decision inside the archetype as well, and plays into the fact that they are a master of all weapons. Alright, so let's jump over to Spellsword. Now this one, while it has a lot of ideas of how cool it could be, remember, I'm always afraid of getting too cool with an archetype, because then it'll stand out among its other archetypes. It'll shadow them, and then it'll be one of the top two or the top archetype, and then the other, 5 or 6 archetypes kind of fall to the wayside, and then you don't really have a class with 8 archetypes, you have a class with 2. So with Spellsword, I pretty much just brought it down to and boiled it down to a very simple idea, which was just an elemental fighter, an elemental swordsman, because we know a mage as an augment or a secondary class, you can choose a school of magic, which I honestly, my brain's barely working right now with all the cold medicine and everything I'm on. But what I'm thinking of is, suddenly your attacks have an electric damage, earth damage, water damage, fire damage, and then the Fire Nation attacked. Something like that. And then maybe, for the hell of it, what if you gave them like a cool way towards like Capstone or the Apex of Spellsword to kind of give them like a shifting sword ability where they can like modify it on the fly. Like, I don't know if you'll be able to, if you pick mage as a secondary, I know you'll be able to switch your secondaries ever so often, but will you be able to change your augment pretty relatively easily? So if I picked mage as my secondary and I chose lightning, and then we're fighting and I'm like, oh, okay, now we're going into a fire-based, I'm in the desert, and okay, and water or ice does more damage. I don't think ice is a selection, but water might be a selection on the mage augment. Can I go back and change that to water? Or am I stuck in lightning and I have to wait until the window to change my secondary class comes up? I think it's a little confusing. So to my knowledge, you pick your primary and you can't change that, okay? And then you select a secondary augment or secondary class to create your archetype. That can be changed every X amount of time. So then what I'm asking is that we know that some of these augments or secondaries, some of these secondary classes will allow you to choose from augments, right? So mage, you can select from one of the schools of magic. Cleric, you can select death or life. These are just things that I know. I don't know about the other ones. Those are the ones that gave us examples. So those are the ones I'm using. So would I have to wait for the larger window of being able to change my secondary class to adjust my augment? Or will my augment have a much smaller window? I'd like to be able to change my augment, let's say, every 6 hours, 8 hours. That might still be long, or what's stopping them from just letting you change your augment like whatever you want? I know it takes away a little bit of the real, but if mage is my secondary, I should be able to change it pretty regularly, or maybe just make me have to go to a town to do it, but I can't do it out in the wild, but I have to do it in a town. I'd take that, but that's what I was thinking for Spellsword, right? You could get a lot cooler with it. I was tossing around ideas of like, I'm big on resource pools, so like building up resource pools, and I'm thinking of like you're attacking and you've got magical attacks, and then you build up to a certain X amount. I just have this vision of like a book collecting pages, which doesn't make sense for this. But you get what I'm saying? Like you collect energy or arcane energy, or you build it up like static electricity. Like the more you're attacking with the magic surrounding you, you're building up almost like magical static electricity, because I can't think of anything else. And then when it gets to an apex, it allows you to launch a very Spellsword specific ability. Some of these things happen in like, man, I'm sorry I keep using WoW. I know a lot of you don't play it or used to or hate it, but that's where I've got a lot of experience in, like building up holy power, or building up, what do shamans build up? Tempest or storm or some shit. But building that up, and then, or a warrior using rage, like you have abilities that generate rage, then you have abilities that use rage. So, having something like that where you're building up this magical energy to then use the stronger Spellsword abilities, that would be neat too. I think both are viable, but I think just similar to the Weapon Master, where I think just being able to modify a weapon or dual wielding two-handed weapons could lock up that archetype pretty solid of being unique and fun. I think just having a fighter with the access to different elements and magical amplifications to their fighter package would lock it up. And then if you want to get super fancy, maybe the resource pool. All right, so then we go to fighter and ranger, and that gives us hunter. What did I say about a hunter? Okay, so this brought up another long conversation that I'll try to keep short, or a long train of thought that I'll try to keep short. So first off, I thought that, what if the fighter, so we know ranger is an augment. What little we do know is that it will increase the range of some of your abilities. So right off a hunter, I was thinking they could have like strikes and swipes and attacks and slashes that are slightly longer. So let's say they put a 5-meter radius on a slash, or whatever. Let's say it's 2 meters. Now it's 5 meters because of the ranger augment, which seems pretty strong to me, honestly. And it does. I don't think it necessarily makes. How am I going to put this? It makes a difference in melee for sure. If I'm attacking another fighter and they can only attack, let's say 3 meters or whatever the measurement is, and I'm able to attack from 5, it's just like boxing. Somebody has a higher reach than you. They're going to be able to tag you a lot more than you are, because you're going to have to move in those 2 meters to get to where you can hit me. But while you're moving in, I'm hitting you. They'll have other abilities for whatever their archetype is that makes up for that. And then you would think that I would have slightly less things, slightly less cool shit, because I have that advantage of a reach as a hunter. But then I started thinking, okay, well then give a fighter a lot of the hunter utility, whatever that would be. Whether it's tracking or finding things in the wild, or maybe tracking down rare beasts, rare herbs, finding hidden paths. However we're going to give the rangers utility in the open world, what if we just kind of ported some of that over to the hunter? That way you could have a fighter with those ranger utility. And then I started thinking, okay, how much of the utility kit for each class is too much to give as a secondary? And the reason I brought that up is, so the best example I can give is, we know a rogue will be able to find hidden doors. I think he said disable traps or pick locks. And if they find hidden rooms and you do whatever needs to be done in that room, it affects loot tables. To what extent, we don't know. You'd have to click on rogue and dig around in there for the sentence, but he says that they'll be able to affect loot tables in a sense. I don't know if that just means that, oh, you found that hidden chest, it's got an extra something in it, or hey, you found that hidden room, and if that hidden room is open and completed, the boss has an extra slot in its chest, or oh, they added this item to the random roll generator in the loot box. You know what I mean? So that sounds really cool. That makes me really want to have a rogue or play a rogue whenever I go dungeon diving, just for that in itself. However, do we let people have that cool ass utility when they pick rogue as a secondary? Not that it would, but would that make rogue less attractive? Like, if you weren't looking for the rogue vibe, and you're like, oh, I always want to play a mage, or I always want to play a fighter, that's just who I play. Oh, well, I'll just pick up rogue, that way I can find all the hidden shit, and we don't have to worry about finding a rogue in our dungeon party. Do you think that would happen? I do, to an extent, but that wouldn't stop the people who play rogue. There are just people who love to play rogue. That's their favorite way to play. Or do you give fighter, in this sense the ranger, the hunter, do you give him the like a couple core ranger abilities and leave maybe the capstone or the apex stuff of the ranger package of utility or what have you? Leave that for the ranger to have as a reward for being ranger primary. I think that's a really interesting conversation, and I don't want to waste any more time on this because I'm already talking much slower and this video is taking much longer than usual. But if you guys have a conversation at the bottom, maybe I can do a video that goes over all these questions that I had as different systems that could come up. Okay, so then we're going to go, but anyway, so I'm sorry. Fighter meets Ranger, Hunter. So definitely I think that the Hunter would have a longer reach on their melee attacks. I was thinking they get some of the Ranger utility, whatever that might be. And then I thought of another cool idea, which is kind of a Ranger deal in D&D, but giving them a preferred enemy or something where they can just select it maybe every day. You can select a certain type of mob and you get a bonus to it. You can even select humanoid and get a bonus in PvP. Now, obviously, you don't want it to be too strong because then the only fighter archetype people will pick is Hunter because they want that extra percent or 2% damage or whatever. So maybe that's a little too much, or maybe it just doesn't work in PvP. It only works in PvE mobs. But I think that would be another cool thing to give them. I don't know if Rangers are going to have traps, but if they do, letting the Hunter have a trap or two would be really neat. I think about playing an up-close fighter, but having a trap alongside of me. That seems like it'd be really cool. And then if you want any more ideas, there is a melee Hunter spec in WoW that's usually pretty bad, but I really enjoyed playing it. It was fun. So that could be another place to draw inspiration. All right, so let's go to Fighter and Rogue, the Shadowblade. Now, this is another one that you could have that strong, like, how much of the Rogue's utility package do you want to give them? I assume that the Rogue class, as a primary, or as a secondary, would give you some sort of bonus damage from behind, similar to a sneak attack. I also playing with the idea of perhaps the Hunter as well as the Rogue lean more into the Dex as their main stat, which might be harder because up to level 25, I'm not sure how the statting will work, but most of your stats might go into a little bit of Dex, but mostly Strength as a fighter, I would assume. And then you choose Rogue as your secondary, and you're like, damn, I wish the last 24 levels I put it in Dex. I don't know how that'll work. That's a whole other discussion. But I was thinking like Ranger could lean slightly more towards Dex, and then Rogue you could go all in on Dex as a fighter, which could be fun. Maybe your attack speed goes up a little bit. Maybe your movement speed goes up a little bit. You get some of the Rogue utility package. You do more damage from behind. And then it gives you the ability to coat yourself in shadows to give yourself maybe a little more evasion. Maybe it allows you to bypass certain resistances just because your blade is coated in shadows, something like that. Perhaps it allows you to, swing with a shadow or make a ranged attack where like you attack but you're attacking out of the shadows. There's a lot of fun stuff you could do thematically or a lot of fun abilities you could do and put into the Shadowblade. I just think the core of it revolving around like getting the rogue abilities, getting that extra damage from behind, being able to pick locks, maybe a lot more evasion addition to it would make you a little more tanky, quote unquote. Just, what am I trying to say? Make you more durable, still not a great word, but you would last longer. You'd survive more because you were more evasive. I think that could lock up the Shadowblade pretty easily. Then we go into Fighter and Summoner. This was an interesting one. For this one, I had a couple ideas. One of them was just that a summoner, because I did a role-playing session where I came up with a character for the Bladecaller, and I had a bunch of theories on that. You can go find those on the YouTube channel. They go deeper into the theories. However, for Bladecaller, I had two predominant ideas. One is that they could summon other weapons from their backpack or their storage inventory if it's on them. With certain attacks, they could summon that weapon out to strike with him. Or they could my main weapon is a sword. Oh, but I have an augmented hammer in my backpack that does a thing. Okay, well, I'm going to do this ability which summons the first weapon in my inventory, and boom, now I swipe. Or maybe there's like windows that specifically for the Bladecaller where you can put weapons and that's what they summon. Pardon me. So they could swing and they could summon that weapon, attack with that weapon. Or they could summon that weapon and when they swing, it swings with them. Something like that. And then I thought maybe they could also just summon a weapon, like a dancing blade, but perhaps they can just pick a weapon out of their inventory. And either that's the weapon that swings with its stats and everything, or or it just gets that, you can transmog it to look however you want. But then while they're fighting, they have a dancing weapon with them, one or two of them, and they attack. And so making the single target into AoE. They're taking all the single target fighter stuff, making it AoE, things like that. And then like little summons can be like little weapons to do things like if you want to trip them, like you swing and you attack and you use the trip ability and it summons like a staff that trips them or something like that. You know what I mean? So that way you're like summoning and using magic, but you're still that fighter martial focused idea. That could be a lot of fun too, especially like imagine being a Bladecaller and able to summon the weapons out of your backpack, but you're also a blacksmith. Like how perfect would that match? You're like, oh, I just crafted these 3 really cool weapons. I'm going to use this one as my main. I'm going to put these 2 in my backpack. I'm going to go fight, and I'm a Bladecaller, so now I get to use my 2 or 3 really cool weapons that I made, and they get to come out and attack with me, and that just like thematically makes like a really badass blacksmith, and I think that would be fun as fuck. So that's a really cool idea that I really like. All right, so fighter and my least favorite name of any of the classes, which you all know, take Dreadnought. Honestly, the first thing I thought about here is I went straight to Warhammer 40k, and all I could think about is a Space Marine with his little fucking chainsword. Not obviously that sci-fi, but that kind of like ridiculous heavy armor because of the tank, right? And a 2-handed weapon. And this was another one I thought they could augment the block. Like, sure, a Dreadnought could use a shield. I don't know. For a Dreadnought, for me, is just all armor, giant 2-handed weapon. Obviously, your Dreadnought doesn't have to be mine. But if I'm a Dreadnought and I use a 2-handed weapon, maybe I get bonuses to blocking when I have a 2-handed weapon. Like, I can still block with a shield and get your basic shield stuff, shield benefits. However, if I use a 2-handed weapon, I block and it's way better. Or way better. It's better. And I think that's a way that they can make the blocking mechanism fun and can help steer the direction of an archetype. So using a single 2-handed weapon, boom, blocking it. I think they could have the ability to like add weight to their weapon. I know that sounds silly, but I don't know. When I think Dreadnought, I think like Juggernaut. Like I just think like a massive form. So maybe they can like increase their size. What did I put over here? Yeah, increase their size. Or when I thought Juggernaut, I think like he can run through just about anything or anything once he picks up momentum. So like they can like be very CC resistant. Maybe they're slower movement speed, but they're slower and more steady and sure and steadfast. So CC has like a reduced effect on them and they can constantly keep moving. Slow effects or things like that have a reduced effect on them. And just the idea of this just massive, constantly get forward figure, hulking armor, 2-handed weapon, like that's just a really cool thought of a tank for me. I'll get to the front line. It's a guy in armor with a sword and a shield, and he's like, "Don't worry, guys, get behind me." It's like, okay, cool, yeah. And then just like a massive fucking form, just leaving footprints because they're so heavy and so big in the armor, and just giant weapon. The guy swings, he blocks with his giant axe or his giant broadsword or whatever it is, and he blocks and then he swings back, or a hammer, or he fucking it's a little guy and he just grabs the weapon and throws it. Like I know that seems epic and ridiculous for a player character, but you know what I mean? Like that's what I think of when I think of this Dreadnought. It's like an actual like full fucking like Space Marine armor that's all plate mail, giant 2-handed weapon, bonuses for blocking with a 2-handed weapon, bonuses for attacking. I think they could reduce his movement speed, reduce maybe the range of movement effects, and increase his durability way the fuck up. Like now, would that be good? I don't know, because we know in action combat how important it is to be able to move. So if reducing range or reducing movement or movement effects by percentage, do you increase their durability and damage by a percentage? That way he's like a slow, quote unquote, slow, like moving threat, but when he gets you, it hits like a truck, or you just can't get rid of him because he's so beefy. And then you give him the traditional pull aggro, and especially for somebody whose range and everything is drawn down, he would need some way to gap close. I would think for a Dreadnought, I don't see him moving towards the opponent as much as drawing them to him, unless they can't be moved, and then it pulls him. That way, like bosses that can't be, only I can think of is Death Grip from Death Knights. But you get what I'm saying? Like, whatever the thematic thing is, they grab the person and pull it to them. It's a boss, that can't happen. So when they pull it, it actually pulls them to them. So that was another way to use a gap closer for the Dreadnought. But that's what I like the idea of it. To be honest, I like the idea of all the fighters. The hardest one for me was definitely Ranger, I think. Hunter just, I had a lot of ideas when we did Ranger intersecting with Fighter, which was a Strider, and you were talking about being a double hitter, going from range to melee to range to melee to get little bonuses to encourage that kind of switch hitting play style. But then when I think Fighter first, and as a Hunter, I just think of somebody just going through the woods, tracking you down, and just killing you. Like a Predator, or a Hunter of Man. So I thought that would be a cool idea, but I think that needs a lot of work. And that's probably out of all of those archetypes that we talked about just now, I think that's my least favorite of all of them. I really like the idea I like the idea of the Bladecaller, because if you can do any of the ideas I came up with and then match it with a blacksmith, are you fucking kidding me? That would be the fucking funnest thing. I would, if it came out that a Bladecaller did that, I wasn't even going to be a blacksmith. I would instantly roll a Bladecaller blacksmith, and that would be what I play, because that would be just too much fucking fun. Dreadnought, if it was like the idea that I had, that might be one of the tank ones that I play, because that sounds great. Spellsword would be a lot of fun. I think it would be a cool, unique way to give the fighter some more magic. Weapon Master could be another really fun one if you're dual wielding those two-handed weapons. I think, like I said, it locks it up. Being able to modify weapons too would be really neat. Obviously, the Highsword has a lot of bonuses with the clerics. In the Bladedancer would be a lot of fun, especially if they could figure out a rhythm or a dance mechanic to play in the rhythm of going with your abilities. So I think all of them sound really fun. I do think Hunter was my weakest. I apologize for that. Again, I'm sorry that my energy level has been kind of lower, but we got through it. We got through all the fighters. Guys, I thank you. I'll put the time codes again in the description. That way you don't have to waste your time through my rambling, so you can get to where you want to be. Thanks again for watching the video. Hey, if you do watch the video, do me a favor and subscribe. It doesn't cost anything on YouTube. It just helps the channel and the analytics and all that jazz, and it helps me out a bunch. We're up to like 24 subscribers, which is really cool for me, since this is just a hobby, but obviously the dream is to get to that monetization point, which is 1,000. That way I could just do this all the time. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. And if you can, subscribe for me. Have a great day. Bye.